Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for tuning in a little earlier than usual this week. I wanted to avoid some overlap with some other content creators in our circles, so consider this the pre-show to Aaron McIntyre's stream with Zero HP Lovecraft later this afternoon. But anyways, I hope that everyone is enjoying their Sunday morning, whether it's their evening time or whatever. I think I have an early enough time this week, so virtually all of my subscribers, no matter what the time zone, can enjoy it today. So with that being said, as we all start to pour on in and tune in, how is everybody doing today? How's everyone's week been so far? I, for one, have been enjoying the fact that work is great. I've been given the clearance to start driving on my own again from the dock, so it's been nice to go to work and to be on my own and have that semblance of independence again. So things have been moving in the right direction my way. Hello, King of Games. It's good to see you. I know that you've been here for a couple of streams now. It's nice to see familiar names and faces. Although I guess at this point it would be just familiar names, huh? Hi, Dave. Good to see you. And yeah, so things have been good on my end. Work has been interesting to say the least. It's been relatively lax and relatively slow, which is even better. I can't really complain at all. On top of that, though, my health is doing well. I mean, the channel is moving in the right direction. I've got quite a few scripted stuff this week, at least drafted and outlined. I've been pretty happy with that. I did get a DM earlier, and I figured I'll just address it now about Prudent Reads. I'm currently going through 2 books right now, Barry Posen's Restraint and Bertrand de Juvenel's On Power. On Power came a little late due to a mail delivery issue. Thank you, Amazon. Thank you, Postal Service. Greatly appreciate it. But most likely that means that I'll probably finish Barry Posen's Restraint first. So with that being said, I'm aiming for something at the end of the month for an episode of Prudent Reads. And I probably will have Mr. Angry Mandrill on again, simply because he's the gentleman who recommended that book to me, and it's based on American foreign policy. And yeah, I mean, it'll be hopefully a good time. Not to mention his experience as a naval officer will help. Steve asking, are we going to talk about overly complex supply chains today? We'll touch base on supply chains and complex systems, although I kind of want to just do a theoretical overview application of the perspectives, both liberal and realist, on how we perceive conflict and international relations and tensions. And so, yeah, it'll be fun. Who are we raging against today? We are just doing a nice, peaceful, and calm theory lecture today, David. It'll be fine. Next week, however, we will be raging against what's happening in Haiti. Professor PaleoCon, I only started early today just because of some issues with other streamers and other creators, so I didn't want to overlap. So I apologize that I'm overlapping with your church time. This was not my plan, but I guess that's a curse of being on Sunday. Well, David, don't worry about the raging thing. We will definitely be raging when we get to some of the more contemporary applications of the theory. Don't worry. But with that being said, and I think I've spent more than enough time just saying hello to everybody. I know that things are a little early today, but let me start sharing the screen and we'll get started with our presentation. There we go. And let's get started. Because this is what everybody comes for, right? That and Frog of the Week. So today we'll be talking about the concept of economic interdependence and its relationship and its complexities in regards to international relations and geopolitical analysis. I had a fun conversation with Clossington not too long ago asking if I could, diversify and cover some more non-realist perspectives as well as topics that are perceived to be liberal or constructivist. So we're going to start doing that. We're going to start diversifying our perspectives. You know me, I have a bias for realism, predominantly a structural or offensive realism. So I'm going to do my best to also explain varying other perspectives and how they can apply in our analysis in foreign policy, because not every single school of thought is going to have everything correct 100% of the time. And like with anyone or any form of political analysis, it's always good to diversify, provide analysis, and understand, how other viewpoints come into play. Because again, you're not always going to be right 100% of the time, no matter how much we wish to be. So today it's going to be primarily in regards to economic interdependence, although later in today's lecture and presentation, we'll also dive into what that necessarily means. How do we define economic interdependence? How we should view that within the lens of relationships between countries. It's surprisingly more complex than just, trade good. So that being said, let's get started. Here we go. So I think it's important for us to define what economic interdependence is, especially within the context of international relations. It's not just simply trade. There's a lot more that goes into it. So I figured that we would open up with this quote from A.A. Cornott. The economic system is a whole in which all of the parts are connected and react on one another. An increase in the income of the producers of commodity A will affect the demand for commodities B, C, etc., and the incomes of the producers, and by their reaction will affect the demand for commodity A. Again, so it's sort of to refer back to the comment that was in the chat here. Yes, there's going to be an important focus on complex supply chains. Everything in a globalized trade economy is going to be somehow interlinked and interdependent upon one each other, whether that's in regards to production, financial policy, how we institute taxes and tariffs, do we engage in free trade. So economic interdependence is going to be one of the most important subjects to look at when we look at our relationships between countries. Trade plays an important, vital role, especially in the post-World War II economy, as things become drastically liberalized since the beginning of the 20th century. So just to give you a brief rundown, economic interdependence, of course, is a byproduct of the division of labor. Eventually specializations will emerge either in production, goods, or services that are provided by particular producers or consumers, which in turn, creates somewhat of a symbiotic relationship that is mutually beneficial between the exchange of goods and services. These, of course, are trading networks and supply chains between various actors within an economy, usually seen within economies of scale, hence the image we're looking at this in a global sense. But it's mainly focused within the specifics of trade, particularly commodities, goods, services, and people. However, there has been a lot of talk inside of international relations theorists and scholars to argue that should be expanded, and we'll get more on that later. And like it's there in the bottom bullet, money supply, fiscal and monetary policy, and reaction in response to such networks also play a huge role in terms of economic interdependence between nations, especially when you take a look at things like the idea of currency manipulation, how much of your money is actually within the money supply that is available for either lending or spending from the government or to provide to its people in terms of, like, say, stimulus that we've been recently seeing in the last year. So economic interdependence is an incredibly complex topic, and I'm trying my best to keep it sort of simple because I don't want to spend an entire lengthy stream just trying to explain what this particular topic is, although I'm sure I could, just simply because it's complex as it is. But this is more or less the bare bones things. This is a reaction to the demand for goods and services and how that affects other demands and other products being out there in the marketplace. We're looking at this through the economies of scale, primarily in a global factor due to the fact that the post-war economy is increasingly globalized, increasingly liberalized, free trade being a primary modus operandi that exists mainly within the West. However, other things like tariffs, protectionism also play a major role in economic interdependence and international relations. So yeah, a lot going on, but hopefully we can break it down and understand some of the varying perspectives of how that operates in the context of international relations. So within IR, there are varying ideas in how this plays a role in the context of studying the relationships between countries as well as geopolitical analysis. There are some scholars that believe that this is low politics, as it can be relegating to a compounding factor, but it's not a catalyst or a determining factor. Usually there are other roles at play, such as whether or not the military is on a strategic alert, whether or not they are pursuing open goals and reputational concerns, as well as the expectations of how another country will act in response to, say, another action, whether that's increasing diplomatic ties with a rival or accessing basing rights in another country. There are those that sort of dismiss economic interdependence as a factor, primarily believing that, yes, nations can have high levels of trade, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they won't engage in a military dispute or have strategic standoffs. Other concerns is that, the asymmetry in trade relationships may increase tensions between the states. And others, of course, view it as a means to strengthen ties, predominantly within Western countries or smaller nations that have economic associations or trade unions that can in turn strengthen their economic bargaining position against larger powers. You see this primarily with, say, like the European Union or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, within Southeast Asia. A variety of small countries that are more or less loosely organized in a trade apparatus in order to engage with larger trading partners, such as like the US, Australia, China, and Japan. But however, because of these varying ideas and these varying perspectives on the role economic interdependence plays in international relationships, you have a fierce debate amongst academic circles, policy advisors, those within government, as to whether or not what kind of, compounding factor that economic interdependence plays in the role of international relationships, especially in a globalized economy where virtually every nation is a player on the world stage, either within terms of alliances, as a regional hegemon, or as a global player like the United States or China. So the subject of debate is primarily about the issue of whether or not this increases tensions or decreases them. So that'll be the subject of the fierce debate that we'll be interrogating later today in our stream. But of course, the idea of economic interdependence has been primarily oriented around opportunity costs. How costly would it be to leave an association, a trade agreement, a union, or to engage in conflict? Is it more worthwhile to engage in a strategic victory and engage ourselves in the profits that come from that? Or is it better to leave things off in the status quo? That is a question that most governments and policy advisors will calculate and ask themselves. Again, why would a nation risk its treasures and blood for something that doesn't pay for itself or generate profit to its government and its people? States have to look for means of revenue. And of course, taxation being one of the primary mechanisms of achieving said revenue can be problematic. And whether or not taxes are too high, whether they're too low, are there ways to skirt them, or do they only apply to certain characters? And of course, war costs a substantial amount of revenue. Or at least it used to. Wars used to be financed by the means of increased taxation, buying bonds. Of course, things are a little bit different now that you can just print an unlimited amount of money, but that's an entirely different story. But again, these are the traditional means in which rational actors would ask themselves these questions. And let's see here. Long story short, the emphasis should be on a symbiotic relationship of plebs with patricians and vice versa. Any imbalance will create harm in the social structure long term. Potentially, it depends on your perspective there. And we'll be diving into that, so don't worry. But with that being said, let's carry on here. So there are varying schools of thought on the subject. Of course, this is due to a vast debate through economics, through international relations, political science. Virtually anyone who's involved in government policy making or think tanks has their own opinion on the subject, and there are varying schools of thought. So, and a lot of this has changed primarily due to globalization. The ideas of economic interdependence providing some sort of peace or providing some sort of harmony between nations and peoples has been around for centuries. However, it has definitely increased in its academic focus, especially as we live in a more globalized and liberalized economy. So this has changed since the early days of the Kantian idea of perpetual peace. It is different from the commonly viewed democratic peace theory or McWorld politics, although many do view them, at least within a certain school, as very much interchangeable. Economic interdependence is typically strengthened through democratic economies. Of course, the McWorld politics, the idea that no two countries with a McDonald's in them ever go to war, although that was disproven during the Serbia-Bosnia issues back in the 90s, it still provides a general neoliberal viewpoint of how nations that are engaged in sort of a homogenous, liberalized economy tend not to go to war because they all mutually benefit from a global economic supply chain. But of course, the question surrounds itself as, does the economic interdependence play a factor in whether or not it increases or decreases the likelihood of conflict, whether that be war, a military standoff, or some sort of bushfire, standoff or dispute. So the two biggest schools I wanted to focus on today is that you have the liberal school, which argues that economic interdependence is a major factor in reducing conflicts between state and local actors. Essentially, the fact is that they do not want to harm the relationship because they would lose access to the very goods and services that allow their economies to flourish, provide revenue for the individuals, provide goods and services for their citizens. So war isn't too costly a factor when it comes in regards to having access to their commodities, goods, services, and trade routes cut off from their potential enemy. On the other hand, you have the realists, which will argue that interdependence can increase the likelihood of conflict due to the differences in the actors' economies. And this is where Miyat makes a good point in the comments here, or at least in the live chat, about the point of, the asymmetry. If there's going to be asymmetry, there's going to be perceived differences between the two nations. They might be perceived as weaknesses, or they may perceive it themselves to be weaknesses, so they need to act in some sort of fashion in order to eliminate said weakness so their enemy can't take advantage of it or their trading partner can't take advantage of it. And that in turn leads to the concept that might lead to the increase of a military dispute. But yeah, so that's been the primary debate, and that's again the overlying question: is that yes, overall economic interdependence in a globalized economy has increased the amount of money that flows around the world, increases revenue, increases the relationship between countries, and entrenches that economic relationship between the two of them. However, does that mean that things are overall going to be better because of the opportunity cost of conflict? Or is it going to be because of perceived weaknesses that they no longer have access to these goods and services because it's no longer domestic? Does that mean that they need to act in order to secure what they would believe to be a strategic interest? And so that is going to be the two schools of thought that we take a look in today. So the first one I thought would be the liberal approach. Whether you consider it the classical liberal view or even now the neoliberal approach, it is mainly seen that economic interdependence is a mechanism of peace. The argument can harken back mainly, the idea of free trade to English liberal and radical politician Richard Cobden, who argued along that free trade in turn increased the prosperity of all nations, quote, making each equally anxious for the prosperity and happiness of both. Both nations want to improve their economic relationships. They want to ensure that because they are trying to mutually benefit from one another, they want to do their best in order to improve their economic output so that their trading partner can increase their economic output as well, engaging in sort of a mutual beneficial relationship for both nations and both parties. However, though, the main criticism to the liberal approach, of course, is that wars still happen. If any of you know about the famous book, The Great Illusion, written, I believe, by his name is Robert Engel. I know I have his last name on here, but his first name escapes me. But The Great Illusion tries to talk about why World War I broke out. It was written, I believe, in the late 1920s, early 30s. It was covered intensely in school. I remember that much. But his argument was that yes, war still happened, despite the fact that nations like England and Germany were vastly economic dependent upon one another. However, his argument was that war still occurred because at this time you're ruled by a variety of monarchies. Even though that they're related, they still hold the view that the only way that you really accomplish anything in the strategic interest, of course, is by to engage in war. And previously, war was still profitable because you could conquer territory and seize it. Remember back in the 1880s, the Germans had managed to capture the Alsace-Lorraine territories from France, which of course was important to the Germans because it was a vital area for coal production. So at the time, the viewpoint that Engel argues is that war is still incredibly profitable writ large. You're going to benefit from war due to the production, due to the fact that more people are engaged within government services. People are going to be on the production lines to produce bombs, ammunition, tanks, aircraft, all sorts of things that are necessary for war to actually occur. So it's still going to be overall profitable rather than trying to engage in trade. That's what Engel tried to argue in The Great Illusion. Now, that of course, is a popular argument to make. Well, if you still view war in the old-fashioned ways of it being profitable through, king and country, then sure. Of course, World War I, Engel sort of benefits from this argument because World War I is sort of the first modern conflict that is of unparalleled levels of destruction in Europe and around the world. Machine guns, aircraft, poison gas, artillery barrages that are unprecedented in the levels of warfare, millions killed outright throughout the course of 4 years. So he argues that, this is an outmoded view. Look at the destruction. No way on earth was this profitable for any country. Not even the victorious nations managed to come out on top. I mean, keep in mind that England and France asked for billions of dollars for reparations due to the war against Germany. So he argues that it's an outmoded perspective. And instead, the liberal school argues that due to higher levels of trade linkages, it's most likely to foster greater communication and transparency. Why on earth would you go to war if you're going to just simply be able to communicate and say, hey, why is the production of X, Y, and Z at the rate that it is? Can we get a lower price? Why can't we talk about this? It's meant to increase the transparency between both countries because both of them are reliant upon one another for the various goods and services that they may engage in trade in. The idea of a prosperous nation is the same as it is back then, as Platonic, more or less, kind of. The school really hasn't changed too much until the 1970s. That's when things really begin to evolve. And we'll get into that in a little bit. JNS77 asked, did anyone profit from World War I other than the United States? Most likely not. I mean, you could argue that Japan certainly did. Japan definitely profited from World War I and its expansion of territorial gains and capturing German islands in the Pacific. And of course, the United States profits mainly because it sort of triggers the end of the old world order mainly through liberal idealism, the foundation of the League of Nations. I mean, we could do an entire stream, JN, on just the consequences of World War I, and I might just do that one of these days because I do need to start covering more history. But I'm going to continue. So again, this is the ideas that are meant to foster greater communications, a stronger diplomatic relationship, because these countries are reliant upon one another, in part because trade can be incredibly centralized in an economy of scale. In the West, of course, the liberal view towards globalization has been seen as a net good for great powers, because why on earth would great powers engage in conflict? One, because of nuclear deterrence, but two, because of the absolutely devastating impact it would have on global trade. I mean, the argument can be made from the neoliberal perspective is that, listen, great powers benefit from free trade. It allows them to exercise military force for the protection of, international trade routes. The United States Navy is well renowned for this, and the neoliberal perspective, in part because of, piracy, keeping those sea lanes open. This encourages other countries to engage in diplomatically as well as economically with other parties that can all mutually benefit from the protection, while at the same time getting access to cheaper goods and services. This, of course, is the famous line go up kind of politics. This is the focus on, the liberal school allows us to engage in communication, greater transparency. They have goods that we have. Our opportunity cost for actually producing them would be higher than what our profit would be, so why not just engage with them? Again, this is where you get the argument about, the line goes up. This is beneficial for the nation's GDP. However, things have definitely changed a little bit since then. At least since the 1970s. You get the famous book Power and Interdependence by Keohane and Nye. I highly recommend that you read this. This is definitely one of the more important changes to the neoliberal model, and when it comes to the mechanisms of economic interdependence and international relations. They argue for the complex interdependence model. This model is focused on the rise of international regimes such as the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, which of course emphasizes the importance of welfare and trade and foreign policy in matters compared to status or security issues. Because we have these international institutions that can help facilitate global development or help understand what areas of the economy need improvement on globally, the fact that every country is now engaged in these international institutions, well, almost every country, and in turn, are focused on the economic prosperity of their people. This is going to matter a little bit more about the welfare of your people and the health of your economy rather than the status that you hold within the country and your security issues. So again, this is where Keohane and Nye argue for, because things are so complex and interdependent, we have also these international institutions, non-governmental organizations, all playing within a role in the global stage. The transitionary idea is that no longer is reputation, status, or security going to be primary mechanisms or the modus operandi of a nation state. It's going to be ways in order to improve the welfare of your people, the welfare of your economy, and to increase trade. They've reflected on this several times, once in the 1980s, once in the late 1990s. I think in 1998 they wrote an article on it. And so both of these famous international relations scholars have argued that as things become increasingly more in this information age, because again, 1998, they're focused on the idea of the internet, things have certainly changed. However, the idea that, now that we have greater means of communication, it's almost instantaneous, it's no longer reliant upon a phone call or a statement to the press, that the interdependence has only deepened and increased and made it more complex, making it all the more important in an age of instantaneous communication, instant access to data, instant access to historical information and trends, that it is important to facilitate communication in order to improve trade, in order to improve welfare, foster transparency, and facilitate a means of which a nation and rational actors can engage in the world stage without necessarily engaging in conflict. So overall, when we take a look at the idea of the liberal school, we're mainly focused on the idea that between countries, this facilitates communication. They want to mutually benefit one another. This means improving mechanisms of production. This means improving mechanisms of trade, whether that's through routes, pipelines, rail, etc. All of this means that we should be focusing ourselves on how on earth we're going to benefit our economy, the welfare of our people, and as well in turn, how that in turn affects the economy of those that we partner with and trade with. This is the classical liberal as well as neoliberal approach. Because of all of these factors, it is meant in theory to reduce conflict. And by extension, doing so, this reduces, war. It's no longer seen as profitable. And by doing so, nations are rather to engage in trade or at least diplomatic communications than immediately go to military standoff or economic sanctions, things that would overall harm the status of the economy and its people. Daniel Chang asks, should we tax foreign nations or toll foreign ships for keeping the seas open and safe from pirates? I don't really have an answer for that, Daniel, because I wouldn't know what the cost of that would be towards our, towards the economy globally, nor would I know what the cost of that would be towards our relationship abroad and how that would affect future trade expectations between the United States and other countries. If we were to start asking for some sort of global tax or a tariff for all, import ships that come towards the United States and our various ports of along the sea, I would reckon that they would be trying ways to avoid it. Tariffs are done purposely to avoid things in the past. I mean, we can see that with various examples during the Trump administration and their attempts to levy tariffs on other countries. Not to mention the response from other countries as well. During the current trade dispute between the United States and China, at least under the Trump administration, a lot of American ships containing soybeans and rice were just left sitting there on the port until the goods went bad. So, I mean, it can definitely harm the economy by moving towards a more protectionist viewpoint. But again, that is, I'm arguing this from sort of the liberal perspective here. I'm trying my best to diversify the opinion and the viewpoints here. So it really does depend. If you wanted to take a more nationalist or a protectionist stance, you could argue that, listen, we provide a service that is innumerable, that you cannot calculate. We try our best to keep the sea lanes open. We enforce the rules of international trade as per se the WTO. That almost virtually all countries are a member of. So we believe that this is only fair. I mean, imagine if we stopped doing things and you had piracy all over the developing world just be running rampant and loose. So why not, give it to us and we can appreciate this and we can put this towards something that is beneficial to our people, say, reshoring companies, reindustrialization, whatever. So it really does depend, I guess, really on what the opportunity cost would be for the said parties. With that being said, that's sort of a brief summary of what the liberal approach is to economic interdependence in the realm of IR. But don't mind me, I'm just having a really good cup of coffee. All right, so the realist school, catalyst for conflict, that economic interdependence can lead to an increased likelihood of military disputes and potentially war. So realists believe that interdependence can be weaponized against other state actors in pursuit of advantage or hegemony. So if you are a neo-realist or an offensive realist like myself, you will understand that those who have a certain economic disadvantage, so say, for instance, China is a really good example. China doesn't have a lot of natural resources for oil and natural gas production. That's why they're reliant upon the Russians and other trade avenues for that. So why take advantage? So take advantage of that. And why not pursue that as a ways and means to prevent a rising power to, seize more hegemony on the world stage? So in order to control nodes of global exchange, so for instance, like we were talking about just earlier, the question about tariffs for sea lanes, the United States, for example, controls a node of global exchange by usually having its Navy patrol the seas of hotspots and keeping sea lanes open and more or less being the mechanism and force behind how global rules for, maritime trade are enforced. This, of course, can be used as leverage through other organizations, through other nations, through international bodies of trade. So again, whether or not you have actual military conflict, it can also create tensions and the catalyst for actual conflict by engaging in, say, disputes through the World Trade Organization. The United States and China have used the WTO infamously from the 1990s till now. In the 90s, it was mainly the United States. More recently, it's been the Chinese bringing a case against the Americans, and it's a way of engaging in conflict by other means. However, because these intentions may not be able to be resolved through international bodies, they in turn can lead to strategic or military disputes between nations. And of course, the most prominent example is sort of the Sino-American relationship, but I'll get to that towards the end. Interdependence, however, can increase the risk of conflict by creating dependencies and vulnerabilities that states want to get rid of. So earlier in the chat, we had a comment about asymmetry. And asymmetry, of course, is going to be a very big factor in the realist school. Because I no longer have a symmetrical, exchange of goods and services, I'm now specialized in one area. It's commodity A. They're specialized in the production of, say, service B. I'm going to try my best to ensure that I'm not entirely economic dependent upon the other nation for service B, because service B is vital to my, national security. We've talked about that a lot during the Trump administration. There was sort of a realist perspective when it came to, say, like steel production or the production of chips and access to rare earth minerals. So things like that want to be cut off. And in turn, nations will act aggressively in order to assert themselves and to prevent that sort of dependency, or to prevent that lacking resource to no longer be cut off from them. Rare earth minerals being a great example, but we'll get into that in the Sino-American relationship. And of course, economic leverage can instigate conflict because an actor might be feeling desperate. If the nation in question, perceives that they're in a position where they're no longer going to have the resources they need to defend themselves, or they're no longer going to have the resources that they need to, say, continue trade, then of course, any sense of desperation usually leads to a lashing out. Now, of course, the idea of responding isn't always going to be in the traditional means of, say, we're going to posture our military in a said, area of the world. It can also be through the use of economic sanctions. And of course, that's been one of the greatest mechanisms in which we see the realist school viewing economic interdependence as a catalyst for conflict, or at least increased strategic tensions between two countries. Most famously over the last 25 years or so would be the American-led sanction campaign against the Iranians. I mean, between rampant inflation that you've seen within the Iranian economy, the fact that they're reliant upon a black market, or they're reliant on hoping that certain European countries will create, companies and workarounds to help increase trade with them. French companies definitely in the past have traded with Iran, I believe, mainly its airline industry, I believe, for production. And they've done their best to skirt American-led sanction campaigns against them. But of course, that can lead a country to lash out militarily in order to fight back through other means. So Iran, of course, has been moving out towards the Middle East. Why not secure strategic interests in, say, Iraq, where you can improve your relationship with a country that you've historically done poorly with, and has been an area of American interest, which is why, since the issues of ISIS came up back in 2014, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard really came into Iraq. They started getting involved in the local community, the local parliament, the local forms of government, to where now there's a significant Iranian block of influence inside of the Iraqi government that has improved the relationship between Iran and Iraq, which, of course, historically back in the 1980s had a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands. But of course, in the modern context, or at least the more contemporary one that we see in the game of power politics and international relations, of course, it's going to be the question of, the Sino-American relationship and whether or not this leads to war. There are many within the realist school that identify that the economic factor may lead to a potential conflict between the two, whether it is an all-out war or a military standoff. So what would be some of these issues? Well, realists, would view the idea that there's an asymmetrical relationship between the United States and China, and greater extent that the United States and China have been battling for sort of who is the dominant economic superpower in terms of global trade. So if you remember last week when we were discussing hegemonic stability theory, we had that wonderful GIF that talked about who was the number one trading partner of the world from 1980 to 2018. And you could watch the blue disappear and the red take over as the Chinese became the more prominent economic trading partner in the world. And of course, interdependence in trade is going to more or less decide where the winds blow and where you see the things standing on the international stage. So that's why the United States has had a very difficult time, for example, trying to ban Huawei and Chinese-oriented 5G from a lot of Western countries. They've had a minimal success besides the United Kingdom and I believe Brazil during the Trump administration on this issue. Other nations have been more open to having Chinese technology, whether that's ZTE, whether that's Huawei or others, all within their borders. And of course, the American response is that, well, we're also implementing 5G. We're having our own network. The concern, of course, is over spying, and of course, having the primary dependent factor being upon the Chinese, which is not necessarily an ally to the West. Sort of that civilizational factor that we've talked about on this show many times before. So there is a lot at play. But on top of that, right, that asymmetry also affects the American military apparatus. So regardless of your opinion on the American foreign policy establishment or its military, one thing that is definitely a well-known asymmetry, at least here in the United States, is the access to rare earth minerals. So whether that's like cobalt, lithium, things like that, China more or less has a 90% market, share of the world's supply of rare earth minerals. They have no problem mining for it, both within their own country and having access to it through, various mines that the Chinese own in sub-Saharan Africa. However, the United States needs that, rare earth mineral resources for its own military, for, radar and heat-seeking missiles, laser-guided rockets, the computer chips that you need to run an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, JDAM missiles, all the things that you would need to keep a modern military functioning. So the rare earth mineral issues can definitely be one aspect of economic leverage the Chinese can hold over the United States if things were to go and something that is perceived not to be in China's favor. So if something were to happen where the United States increases tariffs or engages in sanctions against certain Chinese officials, the likelihood that these two parties are going to continue to engage in some kind of mutual trade over rare earth minerals gives China a significant advantage in its military production capabilities, because the United States no longer has access to one of the most vital resources that you need to run a modern military. And then, of course, this in turn would benefit the Chinese, because as recently they've announced that they're going to be expanding their naval capacity to have a more wet navy and a more international presence, including nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. There's more resources for them. Other realists, such as within, say, certain Asiatic institutions, have argued that the Sino-American relationship is, prone for conflict due to its economic interdependence, and how both of these nations engage in a global economy, and especially in an economy of scale. In part because the American economy is primarily consumer-based, whereas the Chinese have been operating mainly through production, both domestically and abroad. And in turn, that asymmetry can lead to conflict when they realize that there are other consumers out there. It's not necessarily just the United States. This is why you see various concerns over Chinese influence in Western countries, primarily within European Union nations, which historically have been a stronger relationship with the United States than, say, the China. And of course, the growing issue of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is one of the largest ways to engage in sort of a soft power, but also hard power competition with the United States as well. Add on the American strategic concerns within the South China Sea to protect her allies, specifically Japan, South Korea, and Australia, and the growing influence the Chinese Navy has had on various American trading partners like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Australia, and of course the Five Eyes Agreement, now with recently New Zealand leaving Five Eyes to be more engaged with the Chinese under the Ardern government. You see that there is a lot of factors at play that leave it ripe for conflict. The question then becomes, will conflict actually happen? I think that remains to be seen. I think that the Chinese know that they are not ready yet to engage with the United States military head-on, which of course is why we're seeing historically, at least in the last 10 years or so, more subversive methods coming from the Chinese, whether that's Confucian centers, having American professors and think tank workers, spy for the Chinese government, and increase their, diplomatic control over various institutions, whether that be the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and bringing various levies and charges against the United States through the World Trade Organization. The perception of military and, geopolitical weakness by engaging in such activities, of course, is a great way to sway the minds and governments to show where the wind is blowing for future international relations. So there's a potential that they may sidestep conflict, but the likelihood of conflict is still something that many policymakers and policy experts and academics are gravely concerned about. With that being said, let's take a look around with the chat here, because I haven't had the chance to really catch up. Let's see here. Steve says China should try and secure the South China Sea's oil for itself and attain energy independence. I would believe, Steve, that that's probably what they're going to try to do in the next couple of years, and I'm sure that will probably cause tensions between China and Russia, because Russia has made several pipeline deals and agreements with the Chinese over the last several years to provide natural gas and oil to the Chinese. But so who knows? But again, that's actually a really sort of good talking point about economic interdependence. While that would be a great way from a realist perspective, right, to secure, their own energy independence and to secure their own ability to wage conflict and to power their own navies and not be dependent upon anybody, the question then would become, right, is the opportunity cost of pursuing such an energy policy more beneficial and more profitable to Chinese interests than it would be to potentially harm the relationship with Russia? Right? The Sino-Russian relationship is good for China on the grounds that it provides a significant geopolitical bloc against the West, primarily against the United States and primarily against the European Union and NATO. So that the question then, Steve, would become: is that going to be more, beneficial from an opportunity cost and profit perspective than it would be to abandon an important relationship with a geopolitical power that, of course, has been a rival to the United States in the West since the end of World War II? Why would you want to abandon that? So that really becomes a question as well. And even King of Games has a very good point here. Another aspect that a lot of scholars have talked about in terms of what constitutes economic interdependence is labor migration. Labor migration plays a key role, especially when it comes to migrant labor, whether or not that migrant labor is a part of your population. Is it your nationals actually being within your government or being within your economy? Are they going to be loyal? So no, that plays a huge role as well, especially if you have the capacity to, either export or import millions of people. You could argue that migration plays a huge role in terms of the economy for, say, the European Union and its relationship with Turkey. I know a month ago we talked about the Turkish-EU relationship and how Erdogan holds a significant, trump card over the European Union, primarily over the issue of migration. So what way would you be able to benefit from that? Well, if you make sure that millions of untold nationals who have a religion, ideology, and culture that are antithetical to your own, then you have the ability to leverage a significant economic war against your enemy without necessarily using its military. King of Games has a really good point in the chat for those watching now and those who are watching the VOD later on replay. It's a very excellent point, especially when it's difficult to go to war with a country whose nationals are 30% of your population or whose nationals are owner of key industries in your country. I reckon that plays a significant role for, say, Australia and New Zealand and those surrounding nations inside, say, the Philippines and others. And I mean, trade, of course, like we mentioned earlier, and you'll know where the winds will go. The Philippines originally, when Duterte got into office, had initially a rather healthy relationship or friendly relationship, as cordial with President Trump at the time. But of course, we then see sort of an abandonment of the American interest, an abandonment of the American military, trying to opt out the removal of American military and Navy personnel. They started buying Chinese goods and in turn started wanting to increase their relationship with Xi Jinping in Beijing. So we can see the idea that trade plays a major role in how nations perceive where the winds of power are going to be. The Philippines is a prime example. And of course, Chinese nationals being a part of, various institutions of government and the economy, whether that's the purchasing of real estate, whether that's the purchasing of agricultural sector land, or of course, being inside academic institutions like we see here in the West throughout these various Confucian centers. Trade must not just be the analysis of the trades of goods and services in the economy, because virtually everything now is a part of a complex international system that trade needs to include various factors in which contribute to the revenue or at least the profit of a country. That includes the ability to have, well-trained professionals, whether that's managerial or experts in engineering and computer science. So that means academic institutions. And of course, as to reference the King of Games' point, that plays a significant role in how that interdependence can be used to create an imbalance and in turn an exchange of a stronger leveraged position over the country that you're necessarily trading with. It's essentially an infiltration by other means, as Dave Bergeron points out, and it plays a huge role. Glow in the Dark points out that Chinese nationals in Canada was a big thing with the Huawei thing, obviously. Yeah, and Canada has increasingly become very friendly with the Chinese, which is something that we'll probably talk about in a future stream. But that's more or less the realist school, whether it's the classical realism or more structural or defensive realism. You want to secure and prevent asymmetrical imbalances being taken advantage of by the trading partners. Otherwise, the likelihood of use of sanctions, military posturing, or taking things to, the World Trade Organization and trying to levy an international charge against them in order to get others on your side, it is a catalyst for conflict. So with that being said, we have these two schools of thought, one about peace and one about war. And so you kind of have to ask yourself, which one's right? Well, both have varying reasons to engage why that's the case. For example, there was a great study that came out in 2007 that argued that, writ large, since the end of World War II, increased economic relationships have reduced the likelihood of conflict overall across the globe. However, I mean, how can you argue that, right, when there's been various wars across the world The Iran and Iraq war, what happened in Syria, what happened in Serbia, of course, all the wars against Israel, the United States being engaged in Korea, Vietnam, various parts of Southern and Central America. Of course, England going with the Falklands War. So really, how does international trade and economic interdependence lead to that? So you have these two various critiques, right? Because they're not all the time will we have asymmetrical relationships create conflict, when instead it creates greater relationships for peace. So perhaps it's something else. So Dr. Dale C. Copeland in 1996 tried to formulate an answer to fuse sort of the liberal and realist perspectives and try to understand why both of them can be right while at the same time also so very wrong. I believe he wrote this in the Journal of International Security back in 1996. But instead, he also wrote a really good book on it, which I have pictured here. I think I've only read the journal article. I read it last Monday in order to prep for this stream. But I do think that the book, I think, is definitely something I'm going to have to buy in the future. And I would recommend that you do as well. So his argument was that, well, okay, the liberal perspective argues that trade decreases, the likelihood of the likelihood of conflict, which is genuinely true. However, these asymmetries can still exist. Nations will still perceive to engage in conflicts over various resources, whether that's the maintenance of the petrodollar or to pursue some sort of mechanism in which they have the stronger hand or economic leverage in a relationship. So he argues that it's not about the interdependence itself, but rather it's the expectations about future trade. He calls this the trade expectation theory. So he argues that trade expectations about the future of one's economy is going to affect the likelihood of peace of war, not the interdependence itself. Instead, if the expectations are perceived to be good, then yes, we're going to have less conflict take place. If we expect that we're still going to have the same level of goods and services, if not more in the future, then we should continue this relationship because things are going to be just fine. However, if the expectations are perceived to be negative, if they are perceived to be seen that this country A is no longer going to give me commodity X, Y, and Z, it's going to decrease and I need X, Y, and Z and I cannot produce it at home, then the likelihood is high for conflict between these two parties. One of the most prominent examples that Dale Copeland cites in the journal, and I would imagine it goes into greater detail in the book, is that the pre-war period between the United States and Japan, right before World War II, is a very prominent example. Because there are many that would argue, and I think that this is an inherently true statement, is that one of the major reasons why Japan decides to bomb Pearl Harbor and in turn sort of draw America into the war. But of course, the Japanese hope was to sort of prevent the United States from engaging entirely, right, and sue for peace, was that the American sanctions from the Roosevelt administration cut off Japanese access to oil from the United States, which was one of their primary goods that they traded on between there. So the expectation of trade was negative. We're no longer having access to oil. We need this to fuel our imperial interests. We need this to fuel our economy. We're an industrializing nation with what we have at home and with what we have for our factories and goods and services. If that's no longer going to exist and we can't necessarily trade with other countries, keep in mind at the time, Japan has been engaging in now for at least 5.5 years in a campaign against China and Manchuria. You need to maintain that, conquest. How on earth are you going to maintain it without oil and resources and goods and services? So which, of course, leads to the idea that, the Japanese response to American sanctions, specifically on oil, is what brings the United States into the Second World War at the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So the trade expectation theory is a predominant way to, understand the ways of how we can fuse the liberal and realist perspectives on economic interdependence in terms of international relations. Dave says, the liberal one doesn't count with the geoeconomic side of interdependence. Well, Dave, I'm really glad that you brought that up because we're going to be talking about geoeconomics in just a little bit. Don't you worry. But let's take a look here through the chat real quick. Ohm7 asks, do you think that organized non-state actors can control almost entire states, say in Africa, through economic dominance in industries such as natural resources and finance? Or will the government step in and not allow? So that's a really good question, in part because you do have a lot of, dependence upon non-state actors or non-governmental organizations on various countries, which of course has led to a lot of African and other, say, Eastern European states to be very skeptical of international organizations. So, for instance, right, the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court. This isn't necessarily economic aspects, but it does play a significant role in how nations are perceived to engage in a global economy. Right. So a lot of African states within recent, I would say the last 10 to 15 years, have been leaving the International Criminal Court writ large because they believe a lot of the charges levied against various state actors and various politicians and leaders of governments are primarily targeting Africans. And they perceive this to either be racist or prejudicial because they're only targeting developing countries and trying to hold them down, because who would want to trade right with a nation whose leader or ex-leader, committed genocide or committed war crimes or crimes against humanity. And I believe Russia also had recently left as well, I believe in 2015, 16, if I recall correctly. But, that's one example of how, say, an organized non-state actor can engage and have a significant political leverage as well, because political leverage can also translate to economic leverage, which in turn can prevent, you engaging in trade or you engaging with others. The European Union is a prominent example. You can't really have access to the EU when the European Union has various statutes on the books that talk about the importance of engaging with nations that, promote human rights, this sort of liberal idealism, which is why you see the EU constantly, ramming their heads against a wall when it comes to Turkey and the EU. But again, the other issue is, right, that we've seen is that, keep in mind, during the late 1990s, we had what was the African debt crisis, or I believe it was the 90s. It could be the 80s, if I recall correctly. But you had a massive debt crisis within Africa, primarily oriented around loans from Western countries, but also predominantly the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So, you had nations that were crippled by debt, crippled by the fact that they were printing money to try and pay it off, which led to an inflation crisis. So various African countries were under the thumb of debt that was imposed upon them for loans and funds and grants granted by these Western non-state actors through like the IMF and the World Bank. Even to this day, the IMF and the World Bank still play a major role in, trying to help. And I say that with quotation marks. You can't see me because I don't think I'll ever show my face on here. But I say this in air quotes, to help, right? Because there are a lot of countries that perceive their national and economic sovereignty to be questioned by, the assistance of these non-state actors. So yeah, there's a lot that can happen through financial means that can lead to sort of this dominance over a nation state. However, that's why you also see, right, in developing countries, a very strong sort of anti-internationalist, or at least an anti-Western perspective when it comes to economic assistance and when it comes to the International Monetary Fund. Because, of course, what are these institutions? They're primarily liberal, they're primarily European, or at least Western in nature, so they come from the United States. There are institutions that have been primarily Western for decades and are only just now trying to incorporate them, so, from the 1980s onward, which, of course, has led to tense relationships between the developing world, or what was formerly known as the Third World during the Cold War, of these non-aligned states that weren't either, pro-American or pro-Soviet. So there's this significant skepticism that comes with it. So you ask a really good question. Will the government step in and not allow? And a lot of times they will step in and not allow. And I think a famous case study of that, of course, would be the rise of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, the nationalization of the oil industry, the state capture of foreign oil goods and services to sort of prevent the quote-unquote Yankee imperialism, right? So there's definitely a lot in play there about non-state actors and state actors playing a role to sort of dominate these sectors. Governments usually will step in or try to fiercely, condemn it and try to get themselves out of it. USAID, of course, is definitely a really good example as well. USAID is definitely something that you could also apply there. I would argue, we could do a whole other stream on USAID, Dave. Loan sharks with a dubious name is definitely the way that you could look at a lot of Western foreign aid and development, especially because there are a lot of conditions for it. The European Union and their Human Rights Commission is sort of a really good example of that. Although I would argue that the EU has a little more success than USAID does in some areas, like alternative crop development, for example, trying to levy peace in, say, Colombia between the government and FARC. So there are some examples, but yeah, USAID definitely does have some questionable practices there. Photosynthetic Z says, the police are racist to us. It's a geoeconomic phenomena. Who knew? It certainly is. And we could definitely talk about the International Criminal Court in a future stream. So yeah, it's definitely a geoeconomic issue. But speaking of geoeconomics, I think it's important for us to talk about that, because geopolitics and geoeconomics are two different areas of analysis, but they are very closely related. And it's important for you to know the differences of both. So like geopolitics is the analysis of the role of geography that plays on political affairs and international relations. I kind of expand that. I sort of take the George Friedman view that you need to understand geography, you need to understand history, and you need to understand what kind of government they have. But geography definitely plays a role, because wherever you're born, right, wherever you live, whatever kind of country you are, wherever you live and what surrounds you is going to play a major role in your political affairs. One of the most important things in any sort of international relations analysis is always going to be what's immediately right around you. Countries are going to be more important with what borders them than what lives thousands of miles away, which is why, you know, for example, right, even though historically the United States has had a good relationship with Germany for the last 30 years or so, there's a but that's attached to that, because what's immediately closer to Germany? Russia. So, you know, you're seeing an increased relationship between the Germans and Russians there. Geography plays a major role. It's why I do this, because a lot of people in our circles like to focus on the domestic stuff, like to focus on the theory, like to focus on, you know, what books we read. And don't get me wrong, I do that too. But I think it's really important for you to understand what is around you geographically is going to play a major role in how, you know, your government acts, how various elites act, and how said elites in the future need to respond to things. So, for instance, right, say the mold bug dream happens, right, and you get your monarch. The monarch, great, can then take care of the domestic stuff, but the monarch also needs to immediately realize, oh shit, I have to worry about China, I got to worry about the EU, I have to worry about Brazil, I have to worry about all of my trading partners, I have to worry about sea lanes, I have to worry about piracy, access to oil, natural gas. You know, what am I going to do? And I think that it's important that if we ever outline a blueprint for the future, right, if we outline an alternative political formula, if you write your own 21st century Machiavellian edition of The Prince, geopolitics needs to be in there, because you can't just change the system domestically and say, all right, everything's going to be a good now. No, like, you still have to worry about what's outside your borders. You still have to worry about what's going on with the rest of the world. It's the same reason why I don't advocate for like the collapse of the global American empire, the big gay. I don't like the big gay. Most people don't in our circles either. However, I don't want to collapse of the gay, and I don't want to collapse of the you know, the United States. Because if you thought the fall of the Soviet Union was bad, I imagine what happens if America falls, right? Loose nukes, international, you know, boarding and, you know, occupation in order to make sure that trade and goods and services and supply lines still function. Millions of civilians are probably going to be displaced. Anytime that the economy takes a dip, the mortality rate of the country increases by a significant percentage. That's why I don't advocate for it. I would like to keep the infrastructure alive. I just want the governing ideology to die. I just want liberalism to go away. And if we could somehow evolve and create a political formula where we can take over the existing institution, or at least the husk of it, and reconstitute the country, that would be a lot better than just saying, yep, let it all die, let it all go, because the consequences of that would be terrible from a geopolitical perspective. But I'm working on a video on that, so I'm not going to rant and rave for too long there. However, geopolitics nowadays is usually used as a broad term within the field of studying international relations. Things like geography, topography, demography, natural resources, they all play a role in a nation's decision-making process. If you were a country like the United States with oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals that we don't really mine for because of, you know, environmental policy, I mean, all it's going to play a role in your decision-making process when engaging in trade, diplomacy, or even military action against other countries. In the United States, Alfred Thayer Mahan, famous for the book in the early 1900s about, you know, actually late 1890s, about control of the sea. I believe he wrote it in 1896. You know, he who controls the sea controls the world, is considered one of the earliest proponents, and in the United States at least, of modern geopolitical analysis. But there is another half to this, and it's distinctly different, but it is very closely related in how we look at geopolitics. And that, as it was mentioned earlier in the chat, is geoeconomics. While there isn't really an emerging definition, its lenses and analysis are interdependent, pun intended, with geopolitics. This distinction is attributed to American policy advisor and scholar Edward Luttwak. And he sort of argues that there are three major layers of geoeconomics and how we look at it. You have the policy, which is what are you trading with? How are you trading? What mechanisms of trade that exist? Geography, so who are you trading with? Where are you trading with? and how are you trading with? So are you doing it by sea? Are you doing it by air? Is this sort of interstate trade? So you guys border one another? Are you using the roads? What mechanisms are you doing so? And who geographically has the mechanisms to trade certain, goods and services with? So again, this relates back to geopolitics because geography and natural resources play a role in the second layer. And then the third one, of course, is transactional. So who and how are you engaging? Are you engaging through protectionism? Are you engaging through liberal free trade? Are you engaging through monetary policy? But a definition that has been provided by the Chatham House is that it is seen as the use of economic tools to advance a geopolitical objective. So a good example, right, is that Germany is a fantastic geoeconomic player. Geopolitically, not so much because, it's a landlocked country. Its military, readiness is not as good as it should be. It's not necessarily one to wage war in a traditional sense, but it is one to use its economic leverage in order to accomplish geopolitical goals. So whether that's to, get what it needs from Russia by allowing this pipeline to be continued and create a deal with the United States, or to utilize, by extension, its political influence on Brussels through the European Union to extract what it needs from other countries, whether that's debts to be repaid, whether that's to levy a financial policy that is beneficial to the German economy, which is still a massive export base for a domestic country. It still has a lot of domestic production. So how do we improve on that? The use of those economic tools can advance its geopolitical objectives to make it an important power player in regional politics. That's why you've seen a renewed focus on Germany between American policymakers as well as Russian policymakers on sort of who's going to win the battle of influence over one of the largest and strongest economies inside Western Europe. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot going there. But let's take a look now at the chat here. Dave Bergeron says, water politics are also the most important and will be very soon, both naval and freshwater. Yeah, hydrohegemony is definitely going to play a major role in the future. I kind of want to do a stream that outlines what I think the future of that's going to look like, Dave. So yeah, it's definitely something I definitely want to look at because both access to clean water, desalinization, sea lanes, and even what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, right, was about the Arctic. That's going to create new trading routes and new sea lanes for trade. That's why the race for icebreakers is so important. Russia's sort of winning that conflict right now. So yeah, water politics also plays a huge role in here, both geopolitically and geoeconomically, because of trade and how you access, trade and political relationships as well as strategic relationships with other countries. So that's a very good point, Dave. Dave, they would sell the nukes before they are launched. Why waste the money? I mean, probably, but I mean, in a collapse scenario, God knows. So with that being said, that sort of wraps up what I had for the lecture today. I think it's important for us to understand both schools, and I'll be beginning to diversify these opinions, but economic interdependence is one of the largest contributing factors for peace, conflict, strategic and diplomatic relationships in a world economy today. I think that in this society that we live in this completely interconnected world, you can't turn that off. That cork can never be put back in the bottle. Between the internet, instantaneous communication, and the increased, fact that we have tools and weapons that can evaporate the world overnight, the importance of maintaining strong economic relationships and diplomacy means that this is one of the most vital avenues of analysis for geopolitics and geoeconomics today. And I think it is important for dissidents, reactionaries, etc., whoever you want to be, however you want to call yourself, to understand that if you are to provide an alternative formula, if we are to take over, if we are to eliminate sort of the liberal model of government, whether that be removing democracy, whether that be removing neoliberalism, I misspoke there, Jay, and Germany isn't landlocked. They do have a navy. Let's see. But I mean, there's definitely a lot to take a look there. And it's important for you to understand that geopolitics and geoeconomics are things that we need to keep in mind. We can't just focus on the domestic. You also need to focus on what happens in the rest of the world. Photosynthetic Z says, what is actually happening in Xinjiang, and what is the Western propaganda? I tend to think some of the stories are true because the regime seems friendly to China overall. The regime seems friendly in terms of trade, but they also understand that they're a rising power. So you're sort of seeing power transition theory in action. I don't know if I would call them overall friendly. I would say that more of our quote unquote private sector elites are definitely are definitely friendly. I wouldn't necessarily say the government is, or at least nominally on paper, but I mean, they both benefit because there's not really a distinction between public and private anymore, especially in this day and age. I mean, in terms of what's happening in Xinjiang, I do definitely think that some of the stuff that's coming out of the West is probably true. But at the same time, I'm very skeptical of what happens here in the press in the Western world, just simply because you can manufacture consent really easy, and you should watch my video on manufacturing consent because that's really how it works. So I'm not too sure. I really don't have an answer there. Someone asked about the Wagner Group. I definitely think that it's real. I don't think that that's just Western propaganda. I have seen them in other media outlets besides just here in the West. So I definitely think that that exists. I wouldn't be surprised if there's their own private military group akin to American Blackwater happening there. But Glow in the Dark says, I'm not sure how independent mercenary groups are, both for Russians and NATO-aligned groups. They are probably as independent as Syrian rebels. Yeah, and I mean, Syrian rebels, quote unquote, right? They're all paid for by some faction of either the American State Department or the intelligence community. So, I mean, we've had reports that, you've had rebels, quote unquote, fighting other rebels that have been funded by the CIA and others funded by State Department money. So we live in an entirely clown world when it comes to foreign policy, at least here in the West. But as Robert Walsh accurately points out, everything in the news is fake and gay, and that's why you all come here. But with that being said, we're now up to one of our more fun parts of the show as we wrap up here. Been going on for about an hour in terms of the lecture. I think that's usually about the same time I usually start to wrap things up. So with that being said, we are now on to everyone's favorite part of the show. So I have a theme song for this now. This got revealed last Sunday. So make sure that your headphones are ready. I don't want to shock you. You might want to turn it down a bit. I don't know how loud it's going to be. So here we go. With that being said, that was brought to me by Cyberpunk Internal Affairs. I will have his link in the description when the stream is over. He's the one who did that lovely theme for me, free of charge. I'm very thankful for him. I really like it. I hope that you all do too. I'm going to start including that now in all of our future Sunday streams. So I'm definitely very happy with it. But with that being said, for this week's Frog of the Week, I thought that we would do something a little more close to home for me. So I decided to pick the American bullfrog. Of course, the American bullfrog is not really just American, and I'll get into that for just a second. But they are, unlike other frogs that we've talked about, they are inhabitants of permanent warm bodies of water. They are definitely going to be near ponds, lakes, streams, things that are permanent in order to mate and to have their offspring, spawn as tadpoles. Because unlike the turtle frog that we talked about last week, they are like traditional frogs. They have a tadpole stage when the eggs hatch. It is named in honor of the English naturalist Mark Catesby, who was prominent in categorizing a lot of early North American wildlife during the early and mid 1700s before his death, I believe, in 1747. So he is very prominent in sort of cataloging a lot of early American flora and fauna during the colonial period. They are a sexually dimorphic species. So the picture I have here is of a male American bullfrog. You can tell that they're male by their size, but most importantly, by the yellow throat they have just below their lips. That yellow throat is the way that you can always tell if a bullfrog, North American bullfrog, is a male or a female. That and the females are almost twice the size of the males, so that's also another key factor there. They also don't have the yellow throats there. So they're native mainly along eastern North America, so along the east coast of the United States, down to the Carolinas and the Georgia area. However, they are considered an invasive species, so they are now virtually everywhere in the United States, some parts of Canada, and some parts of northern Mexico, but they are on every continent on Earth, to a point where the European Union has officially labeled them as an endangered species. If you have one as a pet, you cannot bring it into the EU. No dice, no frog for you. However, they also hold an immunity to certain fungal infections, which causes concern for conservationists because they are labeled as an invasive species. because they are more likely to be immune to certain fungal infections. The native populations of the frogs are not, which allows them to more or less outbreed and take over if there's ever an outbreak of fungal infections. They're incredibly territorial. So if there are males that are already sort of considered the king of this territory, king of the pond, king of the lake, whatever it may be, they're not going to be very much on the ground. They're going to just be in the water with their heads above, just taking a look around, making sure that their domain remains theirs. If someone wants to challenge for it, whether it's for land or for a mate, they will wrestle, they will fight, they will, puff up their chests, show their yellow throats, make some noise, and then they'll get ready to just go at it. And whoever is the winner, whoever decides to give up first, is the loser, and that person usually wins the land or the territory, or access to mating. They are ambush predators, so they will eat everything from mice to bugs to mealworms, whatever they can find, but they are an ambush predator. They will wait, lying in wait to get the meal that they want. They've been known to eat small mice. It's been recorded that they've even eaten hummingbirds. So they will lie in wait and get exactly what they need and exactly what they want. So that, of course, is the American bullfrog. And just like the global American empire, they're on every continent except Antarctica, and they are everywhere. Violence is life says frog legs are delicious. I've had them before, just not my cup of tea. Male frogs are just as strong as female frogs. Robin Watertree asked, do the females eat the males after copulation? No, they do not. They don't. King of Games, buck breaking frog. Prudentialist says, Ohm says, Prudentialist, can you do a Soros stream one day? How does Howie shorts currency? What does that even mean? I could. I might just make that like a private or unlisted stream. I don't know. That might get me in trouble with the YouTube people. But I would like to. I might do that as a video. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I can definitely add that to my list of future Sunday streams. Next week, though, we'll be talking about Haiti, and then after that, that might just be our concern there. But JN has got a great answer for you in the comments about how shorting currency works. But with that being said, we're at the end of the stream, so this is where I just sort of hang out with you guys and sort of talk about what's going on. And if you guys have any questions or super chats, then I'll answer them and address them here, and we'll go from there. So let me just move to that slide where I start shilling and chilling. That's what I should have done, shilling and chilling. I'll change that next week. That's the problem when you come up with something good right there on the spot. But I know earlier Robert Walsh sent $5 Canadian. Thank you so much. He said, I'm just here for the frogs. Well, everyone knows that at the end of the lecture, the frogs will be here waiting for you. And that's where we're at. While I'm at it, though, I think I'm going to link a little meme in the chat here because I thought it was pretty funny. Let me find it now. Yeah, there we go. So let me find that for you. I'll send it in the chat because I thought that this was pretty damn funny. But with that being said, how are all of you doing this Sunday? I know I asked at the beginning, but all of you started to pour in. So let me ask one more time, see how everyone's doing. Yeah, there's the meme in the chat if you want to take a look at that. I think, posted it earlier in the communities tab as well, so you can check it out there. Can reactionaries ever take over a dysfunctional African country? I don't think you would ever get that. And I would, much like how Conscious Caracol will never migrate, I don't think I would migrate either. There's a certain desire to take care of my country and take care of my people and to take care of the country. I don't want to do that. Farbot M says Memento Frog. Hey, the only certainty in life. Yeah, that's the only certainty with this stream is that you'll have frogs. That's for sure. You'll always have frogs at the end of the stream. JN asked me, am I going to talk about Trumptonshire, AA's positive vision? I have been very quiet on that. I have watched his video. I have watched Right Reaction's response to it. I haven't caught up with everything else, and I haven't watched AA's final thoughts on it. So until I see everything, I'm not going to comment. Regardless of the criticisms of Trumpton Shire from Academic Agent, what I will say is that Yarvin put out a really good piece the other week saying that now is the time to start outlining blueprints for the future, outlining what you want to see be the next political regime or the next political formula. And even though people have had their disagreements to it, I definitely have some issues with it, but I'm not going to get into too detailed here because I'm actually using this whole sort of drama and response to it actually is the intro to a video series I'm working on. So I think it's important that people on the right stop the, masturbatory habit of the esoteric and nostalgic, readings in the past. Don't get me wrong. I'm reading Bertrand de Juvenel's On Power. I'm just as, guilty of that, but I'm also working on this series is more or less going to be 4 parts, an introduction, outlining the current problems of the current regime, ways potentially to dismantle it, what would replace it, and how it would operate. So I'm doing a lot of research on, say, the early Roman Republic and the relationship between the, Rex and the Senate. I'm taking a look at early Swiss republics. I'm taking a look at whether or not you want a constitutional government or something non-constitutional. So this is a big project that I'm working on because I do want to outline a similarly positive vision, but I also want to outline what that would look like both domestically and what that would look like in terms of how, power would be distributed, but at the same time, how that would function internationally as well. So it'll be a 4-part series. This is something to look forward to. It's not going to all come out at once. The introduction should be out sometime in the next week and a half once I finish writing it. I have it more or less outlined. And I'm also working with Marcus to get a lot of my research and my facts right, other than my own research on the subject as well. So I'm consulting with local, in-circle experts. But yeah, I mean, my comment on it is that even though it has flaws, I think that it's important that we start outlining our vision. I think it's important to start creating and producing alternatives rather than just talking about what was and how things are always in decline. So those are my thoughts on it. Yeah, Dave, I do have Albion Seed. I ordered it the other week ago. So hopefully it'll be in soon. Photosynthetic Z says, are we going to talk to Don the Pleb about Afghanistan? I know that brought up on Twitter, Z, so I think I just need to hit up Don and ask when are we going to talk about it, because I'm sure he and I have some very similar thoughts, but I know that he's got more experience due to him being a vet and having deployments. So yeah, I would definitely love to talk with Don, and he and I are pretty close anyways in terms of our relationship. We're pretty cordial with one another. So yeah, I mean, it'll most likely happen. I don't know when, but it will. So yeah, that will definitely happen. Don't worry. See, I don't know when, but it will happen. I am not Gandalf asks, how can we join classical and quantum physics credentialists? I am not an expert on either of those. I am not Gandalf. I am a simple man who manages finance. So I'm more of a money, budgets, and proposals kind of guy. I am not that well versed in that area to join those two. If you have any literature that you would like to recommend, or someone I should watch to get a better understanding of said topics, by all means recommend it to me. But in the areas of, say, physics and more complex mathematics, I am definitely within the midwit category, which is why I don't talk about physics. It's why I talk about things like international relations, because this is what I studied. This is what I know. I had original plans to be a lawyer, and then I realized after working for like 5 years in law offices, I was bloody miserable. So I said, screw that. But yeah. Violence is Life says, in my opinion, the best way to determine an answer is to create an MMORPG and use to solve it. So like creating a simulation, I'm all for it. That's not a bad idea. Phenami says, the Trumptonshire thing from AA would be a great way to launch into a discussion of piles. AA is allergic to recent fiction, but the reading of the Diamond Age would be would be good for him. Perhaps Aron or Charlemagne, who I'm sure I've read it, could explain it to him. I have not read the Diamond Age. I would have to look up a really good description of it, but yeah. Bucko says, physics is gay, applied physics is for the cool kids. See, I'm just going to stay out of that one. I don't know. Glow in the dark asking me questions. Oh, like what is the best method for pricing stock options premiums? Well, considering the organization I work for doesn't even have that option, or isn't publicly traded, I couldn't really tell you there. Oh, files. Okay, thanks, Phenami. I appreciate it. Great White Lobster asks, do you do any saltwater fishing credentialists? Well, I don't live anywhere close to an ocean, so the answer to that is no. All of my fishing has been freshwater within recent years. I live close to some lakes. I have a pond where I live, so Freshwater for me. I have not done any saltwater fishing, although I want to make it a goal in life to do some saltwater fishing. So once I'm in a little better, state of health, and I'm a little more settled in this job, I think I'm considering a vacation. So I was Clossington and I have joked about like traveling over to where he lives. He's somewhere on the East Coast and doing saltwater fishing. I might actually make that a reality one day. Who knows? But no, great white lobster. I haven't done any saltwater fishing. Ohm7 asks, Prudentialist, how do we become rich? Rich financially or rich in spirit and in health? Because to me, the surefire way of being rich is to be confident in your values, to not waver from them, to have faith in God, and to work hard and identify, skills and means in which are going to be productive for you and can provide you the material means to at least be successful and wherever you live and wherever you may be. It's also important to foster community. It's also important to be seen as an example to your neighbors and to your kids. If you have them, or if you don't, you should. We have an obligation to reproduce. Financially, I think that you can't answer just financially. I think it's important to do. You need to have a good network of people that you can rely on. You need to be seen as a community leader, someone who speaks up, someone who's invested in himself and his family. But financially, I mean, unless you're going into the trades or unless you're going into a hard science like civil or electrical engineering, I would recommend vocational things. People are always going to need electricians. People are always going to need plumbers. So I would recommend that you do that. Prudentialist, how do we enter the kingdom of heaven? That is not a question for me to answer. That is a question for your priest to answer. Read your Bible. That's all I'm going to tell you there. But if you're referring to the kingdom of heaven in regards to, say, like Jerusalem, I mean, if we're going to reference that movie, I mean, it's nothing, but it's everything. Great white lobster refers to saltwater fishing is great. Catch little fish to catch the big fish. I mean, you can still do that here where I live. I definitely use minnows to catch the fish that I have. I've caught, catfish and smallmouth bass with having minnows as bait. Robert Walsh asks, are you the frog king of your pond? Well, ironically, I don't have a lot of American bullfrogs where I live. I do have these like tiny little frogs that are like maybe an inch long tops, and they just hop everywhere. I like to think that I'm the frog king of my pond. They don't bother me. I don't bother them, but they know that I'm there to fish. I'm there to keep the snakes away. So yeah, I guess I'm the king of the pond. The king of a very small pond. But J.N. says, don't worry about it. We'll all be poor after collapse. Ain't that the truth? But yeah, I mean, if you don't fish, you should. There's no greater way for a man to waste his entire weekend than to just be sitting out by the lake or sitting out by the pond or wherever with a rod in your hand and just hoping that something bites. I have spent hours upon hours just out there on the pond doing, usually nothing, just sitting there hoping for a bite as I keep casting and reeling. It is one of the greatest and simplest pleasures in life. I highly recommend that everyone does it, regardless of where you live. If you live in the city, go drive out for an hour and a half and go find a place. It is worth paying the money for a fishing license if your state requires it. I cannot recommend it enough. You should definitely go do it. Every man a king of his own pond. Yes, embrace Huey Long, embrace the fish pill, go fishing. But with that being said, as you've noticed on the stream here, I have this lovely frog here on top of some money. I'm going to just shill for a little bit here. Of course, there are two options for you to shill. Well, technically three. There's super chats. There's YouTube memberships. You can just hit the join button. And, of course, my subscribe star link. I use that to, pay for my medication without dipping into my salary. And I also use it to buy books for this channel for future videos and episodes of Prudent Reads. So by all means, I would highly recommend that you do. And you should also support other creators as well that you really appreciate and do it, because I treat this like a job. I treat this in a way to make sure that I can produce content for you guys that enjoy. I love doing the Sunday show, but I also know based on recent polling that I've done with the YouTube community tab that you guys also like the scripted takes. So I do my best to provide you both. And I'll have a scripted video out actually next week. I'm going to be a little bit ranting and raving about that recent Hill opinion piece about comparing Biden to Justinian. That just really irked the crap out of me. And it'll be a mix about comparisons and the balance of power in the world stage. The King of Games says the Prudentialist, should currency shorting be considered an act of war and people? It can definitely be used as an economic weapon. A lot of shorting of currency and has been seen as a way to bet against an economy. And in turn, if you short enough, even if it's done speculatively, it can definitely create a trend. An act of war, I mean, it would be possibly, but I mean, most people will react to economic attacks the same way that they do to posturing, usually through sanctions or through other financial means, but it can definitely be considered an act of aggression, yes. Farbot asked me, have I seen Panama Hat's recent video? I have not, but now that you recommend it to me, I guess I will watch it after the stream. But with all that being said, all I'm going to ask you all now is that if you could like the stream, because that always helps the YouTube algorithm. But most importantly, I want you to share it. We are halfway there to my goal of hitting 3,000 subscribers by the end of the month. I would really like that to continue. We're also seeing really good growth on Twitter as well. I will be starting to create an Odyssey account to have a background there. And I'm also going to put out a video there sometime before the end of this month that will be an Odyssey exclusive, simply because I'll be talking about things that I can't really talk about upon YouTube. Which includes Virilio and the concept of a genetic Hiroshima. So we'll get into that later. So I do have a lot of things planned for you guys. It'll be great, which includes alt tech stuff. I'm going to start doing more subscriber-based things. So those who are, backers on Subscribestar or YouTube memberships, you guys will get access to certain videos and streams first, and then I'll release them prior to or afterwards for the rest of you guys to enjoy. So all the more incentive to join the Frogatorium on Subscribestar or buy YouTube memberships. So with all that being said, now that we're towards the end here, I also want to shield one more thing. In a little bit, Aaron McIntyre is going to be streaming with Zero HP Lovecraft to talk about horror, fiction, art, and culture in the modern day and age. If you don't know who Zero HP Lovecraft is, he is a fantastic writer. He is a fantastic fiction writer and a great commentary guy on Twitter. He's been retweeted by BAP. He's been retweeted by numerous people online. So if you're not familiar with him, you really should be. He recently put out a really great short story called Don't Make Me Think. So you really should watch that afterwards. It's the reason why I moved to the stream up to earlier in the day in the morning. So with all that being said, all that I can ask you guys, and I'm really thankful. I had someone message me the other day, asking, hey, what are we going to be covering this Sunday? And I'm not one to really gush over the parasocial relationship, but good Lord, did that put a smile on my face, because someone went out of their way, added me on Twitter, and just says, hey, what are we talking about this Sunday? I really enjoy that. I like this. I like this little side job that I do. I have a full-time job and a boring office wagey that I am. I have a desk and everything. But man, do I love doing the show every Sunday. And man, do I like writing scripts and putting videos out, even though I'm a terrible video editor. I think when I start making more money, I'm going to start paying for one because I need better production value. But I love this stuff. And Farbod says, rip BAP. Yes, if you don't know, Bronze Age Pervert was banned off Twitter, but he is on Telegram. So under, I believe, Bronze Age Revivalist. So you should definitely follow him there if you're still interested in following him. And in fact, when I'm done with the stream, I will put his Telegram link in the description so you can follow BAP still. He does have some sort of consortium on Twitter, sort of posting his ideas and thoughts, his close circle of friends. But he does plan to return to Twitter one day, and he's still doing his Caribbean Rhythms podcast. So yeah, it's still doing well. Tuesday, hello. I'm glad that you can make it. I'm glad that you're here. But yeah, and Phenami, yes, Aaron is killing it. I hate to admit this on stream, but I am jealous of how well he's doing. But I'm also optimistic, because if someone in the sort of neo-reactionary sphere is doing this well and is getting all these people to follow him and retweet him and say all the good things that need to be said, then I have optimism for the future that Yarvin idea of channeling low energy politics into some meaningful change could actually occur. But as we near the 1 hour and 30-minute mark, I will leave you all with this. If there's anything to take away from this lecture, it's that we need to understand that as dissidents, reactionaries, whatever you want to call yourselves, geoeconomics and geopolitics need to be an important avenue of analysis that we keep in our ways of looking at the world. We can't just focus on the domestic. We also need to focus what exists outside of our borders and what we will do after this sort of neoliberal regime falls and we change it. It's great that these things are happening. And also, Cyberpunk Internal Affairs is in the chat. You should follow him on Twitter, and you should follow him on YouTube as well. He's the guy that created the Frog of the Week theme for us. So if you could all give him some support, by all means do so. But again, all that I ask from you guys, more than I ask for money, I greatly would appreciate you guys sharing it. The more people know about this sort of analysis, the more people know about the channel, the more we grow, the more people get to enjoy the Frog of the Week every Sunday, and that would be fantastic. So with that being said, ladies and gents, I will have a video out hopefully this week that's scripted. Next week, we're going to be talking about what's recently been going on in Haiti, the international response to it, and what that means for the country itself. And I will see you all next time. So be prudent, everybody, and take care, and I'll see you all next time. Love you guys.